Alexis Conran on Times Radio.
Now, if you'd like to know what's in the Sunday papers, but you just don't have the time to wade through them, then we are here for you. Worry not. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be mining the Sunday papers for the important stuff, the funny stuff, and the you couldn't make it up stuff. Here to help me is my expert panel, Kirsty Buchanan, former political editor at the Sunday Express and special advisor at 10 Downing Street, now campaign director at Mainstream UK. Kirsty, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you.
Lovely to have you back. And joining us as well is Gary Stevenson, an economist and former cities trader. Good afternoon, Gary.
Afternoon, Alexis.
Now, look, before we kick off, I'm going to ask you the same question I've been asking the listeners. Your favourite Christmas songs, your personal number ones. Kirsty, which song are you going to go for? It doesn't have to be a Christmas song, by the way.
Yeah, I'm a bit bar humbug when it comes to Christmas, to be honest with you. So I don't tend to like most of them. I'd probably have to go with Fairy Tale of New York, probably the Pogues.
Oh, nice.
Not hugely Christmassy, but...
Well, no, it is a Christmassy song, I would say. But yes, it's not your sort of jingle bellsy in the background Christmas song and singing about snow. But we quite like the Pogues for Christmas. Gary?
I think the one that most reminds me of my childhood has got to be that Mr. Blobby one, isn't it? I think the title is probably Mr. Blobby. I was about 7. Yeah, I loved it at the time.
I have to say, I've been saying to the production team, like, let's pick people's favourites and try and play them later on. I guarantee you, Gary, we're not going to be hearing Mr. Blobby later on.
It's a real shame.
Bit of a shame. Now, look, let's kick off by having a look at what's in the papers. Let's look at the front. The pages. Kirsty, why don't you kick us off? What are the Sunday Times leading with?
Yeah, so the Sunday Times has got a data story that is a warning about the impact on the NHS of unvaccinated COVID patients. So 90% of COVID patients that require the most specialist care within the NHS are unvaccinated. Mm-hmm. And between 20 and 30% of critical care beds in England are occupied by COVID patients, of which 3/4 of those are not vaccinated. Now, when you think we've got 5.8 million people on the waiting list for NHS care, some with quite life-limiting conditions, you can see why the impact of that is causing a great amount of anger and upset for NHS doctors and nurses.
We'll discuss that story in a little bit of depth in a moment. Let's have a look at some of the other headlines. The Sunday Telegraph, Gary, what are they leading with?
Sunday Telegraph is leading with COVID pill to be rolled out before Christmas. So there's a new drug. It's called Lagevrio or Molnupiravir. So jot that down. Sajid Javid has described it as a game changer. It's not performed so well in clinical trials, but it's been passed. They're going to roll it out for Christmas. It's not going to stop Omicron, but hopefully it might reduce the number of deaths we're seeing from COVID.
OK, Kirsty, take us to The Observer. What are they leading with? Kirsty, are you with us? No, we'll try and get Kirsty back. I can tell you The Observer has been leading with Johnson faces trust crisis as sleaze shatters faith in MPs. Not good news for MPs. It turns out quite a lot of people, their trust in MPs and all politicians, no matter whether they're Conservative, Liberal Democrats, Labour MPs, are enjoying the worst trust numbers we've seen in a long time. We're going to try and get Kirsty back when we can. Gary, I hope you're still with us. Let's look at The Sun on Sunday. What are they leading with?
Yeah, The Sun on Sunday is leading with the very important story, TV celeb Danny's divorce row. So Danny Miller, who I'm reliably informed is an Emmerdale actor and is on I'm a Celebrity, is engaged to a woman who is already married but separated many years ago. Everybody's moved on, found new partners, is very happy. Hopefully The Sun will move on soon as well.
Very well handled, Gary. Very well handled. Now, the Mail on Sunday is a story we're going to talk about in a minute. It talks about Prince William's mental health crisis. We're going to get into that a little bit later. Gary, the Sunday Mirror, what are they leading with?
So the Sunday Mirror is leading with our loved ones died while number 10 partied. And I think everybody will have heard about this story. So last December, while London was in Tier 3 restrictions and many people's parents and grandparents were very sadly dying in hospital alone because we weren't allowed to go see them, apparently number 10 was holding parties for 40 to 50 people. Lots of sad stories there about people who couldn't see their parents, their grandparents, and massive parties for Boris at that same time.
Yeah. Today, Dominic Raab, when he was doing the media rounds, he said the Metropolitan Police are not used to looking at incidents that happened over a year ago. And that seems the government line that has been taken, that no rules were broken, and what happened a year ago, even if it was rule breaking, is not something the police would be interested in looking into. I think the public might have a different opinion to that.
Yeah,
but let's see how that is going to progress. I believe Kirsty's back, and she's ready to take us back to her old stomping ground, the Sunday Express. Kirsty, what are they leading with?
This is a quite a sweet story. A couple of papers have splashed on different elements of this Prince William podcast, and this is about his memories of his mother and how they used to sing to calm his nerves on the way back to boarding school.
Yeah, I thought that was a very sweet story. Saying Tina Turner's Simply the Best when he and Prince Harry were being sent back to boarding school, which can be quite traumatic for kids when they're leaving their family to go back to boarding school. Gary, the Independent Online, they're the only ones who are dealing with a completely different story to the rest of the papers. What have they gone for?
Yeah, but I think it's an important story. It's top Tories tell Patel to overhaul the asylum system. So, everybody will have seen these terrible stories of many people dying trying to cross the channel. Apparently, some people want to allow asylum seekers to seek refuge at any embassy all over the world, which basically means you don't have to make that channel crossing in order to apply for asylum in the UK. And, we'd love to see the details. We can talk about it a bit more, but it sounds like potentially a way to prevent these terrible deaths from happening, which, we need to stop if we can.
We're going to get stuck into that story a little bit later. Kirsty, the Sunday People.
Sunday People, yes. Now, this is, again, a very important story. So Paula Hudgell, who is the adoptive parent of Tony Hudgell, who was a little boy who was tortured so badly that he lost both his legs, has successfully campaigned for the introduction of Tony's Law, which is going to bring in tougher sentences for people who cause the death of children. She wants the Justice Secretary, Dom Raab, to go further, though. She wants a sort of life register, if you like, for people that are convicted of committing violence against children, much as we have a sex offenders register. So it's an important intervention from her, I think.
OK, and finally, Gary, another favourite one for you, giving you all the celeb stories. The Star on Sunday. David Gillan, I believe, is on the front cover.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit ridiculous following up after that extremely serious story, but the Star is running with David Ginola, I Raise the Dead. When David Ginola, who was a former footballer for Newcastle and Tottenham, did a séance when he was a teenager. They spoke to the deceased mother of one of his friends. Great for them. If I could speak to my deceased nan, I sure would have a lot to talk about. It's been a while.
Right. Well, look, let's kick off with that big story that's in the Sunday Times. Doctors' anger as unjabbed fill emergency beds. Top consultant says cancer ops are being delayed. As Kirsty told us earlier, we are having 9 out of 10 people on ventilators are unjabbed. And I find this a little bit odd. I mean, I follow a few accounts that I would describe on social media as anti-vax. Although, if you ask them, they'd say they're not anti-vax, they're pro-choice. But they seem to be doing everything they can to sort of take away any confidence in the vaccine. But they insist that people should have a choice to take the vaccine. And I don't quite understand their argument, because they're also the same people who are anti-lockdown. And they're anti-lockdown because they say that lockdowns, of course, have an impact on other elements of people's health, missed appointments and everything else. And what I don't understand is how they cannot see the fact that unvaccinated people ending up in ICU does also mean that people with cancer operations, people with emergency operations, cannot afford to get these operations done, Kirsty, because those beds are being taken up by unvaccinated people.
Well, yes, indeed. As my mother used to say, though, there's no arguing with stupidity. So, look, we've got 5.8 million people on the waiting list. The Health Secretary said earlier in the year that our health waiting list could rise to 13 million over the winter. I mean, you shudder to think about it, and the potential for lives lost on it. Now, look, I don't believe in mandatory vaccinations. If you don't want to get vaccinated, you pays your money, you pays your chance as much as if you smoke or if you eat to excess. But having said that, what I do really object to is the sort of anti-vaxxer brigade, the Piers Corbyns of the world, spreading disinformation that frightens people into not taking vaccines. That's what I object to quite profoundly. Now, I mean, I had breast cancer last Christmas, and one of the things I was most terrified about was that my cancer operation would get cancelled because of COVID and because of lockdown. I cannot imagine how awful it must be to have cancer growing inside you and be told that your operation is cancelled because you simply don't have the beds or the surgeons to be able to cope with it. And, you know, if I had one sort of magic wish, if you like, in changing laws quickly, it would be some severe punishments for spreading medical disinformation that frightens people out of getting vaccines.
Gary, what are your thoughts? A few people reacting to this story. Again, there's the usual suspects who are, as Kirsty is saying, spreading sometimes not just misinformation, but just distrust, if you like, in the vaccine, are saying, well, actually, if you're going to blame unvaccinated people taking up beds at the ICU, then you should blame heavy drinkers, heavy smokers, people who are not looking after their health. My argument to that would be, I think with drink and smoking, that is, you could class that as an addiction. I think not taking the vaccine has nothing to do with the vaccine. That is just a choice that people have. What are your thoughts on this story, Gary?
Yeah, it's an important story, and it's not going to go away because we're still seeing waves of COVID, and it's leading to a massive backlog for the NHS. So the NHS is going to be crowded for a long period of time, and this unvaccination issue is important. I mean, for me, I live in East London. I'm from East London. I grew up in quite a poor area, and what I find often is there's a lot of people in the area where I'm from, friends from my childhood, that are very sceptical of the vaccination, and I think it's because they've sort of lived in the last sort of 11, 12 years where the government is doing nothing to help poorer people, and yet richer people seem to get richer and richer, and they've lost faith in the government over time, and it's led to this situation where we have a really serious issue here, and there's so little faith in government that they're unwilling to get vaccinated. But I think the most important thing is that we address how can we change this, because pointing our fingers at these guys and calling them stupid is not going to improve anything. And now I think we need to consider, can we offer financial incentives to people to get vaccinated? During the first year of COVID, we saw the biggest ever increase in billionaire wealth in this country. The average billionaire increased their wealth by £620 million during COVID. Maybe rather than rising national insurance to ordinary people, we could tax these guys and pay people to get vaccinated, helping reduce inequality and also solving this health crisis.
Okay, I like it. It's a thought. Now, look, Kirsty and Gary have got plenty of stories to take us through all the way up to 2 o'clock. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has ordered a wide-ranging national inquiry into the murder of Arthur, involving police, schools, social services, probation watchdogs. And this is to learn lessons from the case. The Mail on Sunday notes that Attorney General Suella Braverman is to review whether the sentences handed to Arthur's stepmother and his father were too lenient and should be referred to the Court of Appeal. Now, during the couple's trial, it emerged that at least 3 warnings from family members and teachers about Arthur's plight had not been heeded. Gary, what was your reaction to this story? We are going to have a review, as we spoke about a little bit earlier, but we've had many reviews. But we've heard from one of the people who carried out the inquiry to Victoria Crombie case back in 2000, Lord Laming, who spoke to me at the beginning of the show, that reviews are helpful because you get to establish the facts and find out exactly what went wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, just listening to the grandmother speaking there, the obvious reaction that anyone is going to have to this story is an emotional reaction, because it's a heartbreaking story, and anyone who listens to this story, I think should just take a bit of time to think about, not just Arthur, but all of the kids in this country who have to deal with abusive situations at home, because unfortunately it does happen. And we have a social care system, and there obviously needs to be a review, and we don't know whether there was a case of negligence in care. We see in the story that 3 people within the family tried to sort of raise alert, and they were investigated, but no further action was taken. My mum was a social worker, and I remember when I was a teenager watching her. She had an enormous caseload of so many kids, and I think she knew that it was too many, and she would have loved to have more time to give each one of these kids the attention that they deserve. But the caseload she had was so enormous that she just wasn't able to give everything the time that they needed. So I think we need to be open-minded. We need to have an inquiry and understand, possibly there's big mistakes made by individuals, and if there are, We need to find them. Possibly there's systemic mistakes in the system, but also possibly there's just a problem of underfunding and not giving enough social workers that we need to prevent terrible things like this from happening.
Kirsty, social care has been a big subject. And as Gary was mentioning there, the funding of social care has seen, our recent tax rises to national insurance contributions. Is this again going to come down to underfunding of social care, or not having enough people? Again, real life experience there from Gary and his mum, too many kids, just one person dealing with it. And in a way, even though Lord Laming said you always need a review or an inquiry to establish the facts, are we going to get back to exactly what we get back to every time, which is we need to put more money into social care if we want to give these kids a chance?
I listened to Dominic Raab this morning saying, an additional £5 billion had gone into local authorities. I
think it's 50 million, if I'm right. But we'll double check that, because $5 billion sounds a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot, and 4.8 billion to be precise went into social care for local authorities to handle, its pandemic response. A good deal of which will have gone into social care funding. I mean, look, some of this is resources, some of this is systemic, some of this might be individual failure. The truth is, at the moment, we simply don't know, and we will have to wait for the inquiry. But we've had a number of these inquiries and a number of these appalling incidences. Baby P, Victoria Columba, Daniel Pelker. Quite often, what has seemed to have happened is that warning signs are not picked up on. It was definitely the case with Victoria Columba. There were 17 specific incidences where intervention could have perhaps saved her life. Daniel Pelker, the school teachers reported him going through the bins looking for food. And again, with this case, we hear that the uncle and the grandmother both raised the alarm. The social services were involved, and so were the police. So, it's too early to say. It's too early to rush to judgment on it. But I wonder whether resources are always the answer. Sometimes it is either systemic or simply individual failure. But let's not rush to judgment on this terrible, terrible case. We'll just have to wait and see how the inquiry rolls out.
OK. Let's move on to another story. This one is in The Sun on Sunday. This is Boris Johnson waging a war on drugs. He's given an interview to The Sun on Sunday in which he says he will unleash a war on drugs next week. In fact, the paper reports he will unveil a 10-year plan to invest millions in rehab for addicts, coupled with harsher penalties for pushers and recreational buyers. One eye-catching measure the paper highlights is that in an attempt to target middle-class cocaine users, courts will be given powers to take away passports from users caught with Class A substances. The paper says that the usual fines aren't much of a deterrent to well-off people who might pass around cocaine at posh parties. Now, Mr. Johnson says politicians have dithered over the scourge for too long, sometimes because they once dabbled in drugs themselves and don't want to be asked about it. The paper reminds us that Mr. Johnson has previously admitted trying cocaine at university, but it said it made him sneeze and had no effect. And he's one of many cabinet ministers that has admitted to drug use. Gary, the war on drugs, I think I can remember that phrase from the Reagan era in the 80s. I think we can safely say that the war on drugs has been a complete failure in the decades that it's been in action. Where we are seeing improvement in countries like Portugal, for example, is when there is a different tack to tackling drug issues. Some of them by taking away the criminal element of drug use, some more progressive thinking around drug use, rather than the same old war on drugs, we're going to come down hard and stop it. The one fact that you will not be able to stop is that people will use drugs recreationally. And no amount of legislation and measures that you can take is ever going to stop that, really.
Yeah, I've said I grew up in a poor area of East London, and, there was a lot of cannabis use around me in the area I grew up, and I've seen the damage that it can do to people and to families and people's lives. And, after that, I went to work in the city for 5 years. So then I've seen the damage that cocaine can do to people as well. And, it's people from totally different backgrounds in totally different spaces. So, what you have here is people from very different backgrounds using drugs for very different reasons. I think the statistics show us that this sort of this sort of language, war on drugs, clampdown on drugs, it hasn't tended to be effective. For me personally, having seen so much drugs around me, I think you need to look at the reasons why people are doing this. Often there's mental health reasons in the background. Often, especially when people come from poverty, at the moment we're seeing a situation where people's financial lives are getting more and more difficult. What I see a lot of in London is young men being told you need to make money and get rich, but there's no opportunities for them to do that. And this is causing these guys to get so stressed out, they're looking for any kind of relief. So to be honest, I think it's a little bit of political point scoring because he knows it will work well with some people who like the idea of tough on drugs. It's not working. If you're not dealing with the actual fundamental issues that are happening in people's lives, I don't think you're going to make any progress.
Kirsty, I want to pick your brains on this because the Sunday Times today reports that sniffer dogs could prowl the corridors of Westminster amid fears that cannabis and cocaine are openly used on the parliamentary estate. It says Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle, is investigating Westminster drug culture after traces of cocaine were detected. An anonymous special advisor tells the paper that everyone knows who in Westminster is taking drugs and which offices to visit to buy a joint. Now, in your previous role of working in the papers and the Sunday Express, going up and down the corridors of the Palace of Westminster, was there a sort of a common knowledge that drugs were being used on the palaces of Westminster, on the estate?
Yeah, is the brutal truth.
Oh, well, there we go.
Look, I mean, not to the point where I'd say, turn right on the fourth floor and you can score a joint from, room 20, whatever, but yes, I mean, you knew who was using and who wasn't. It was pretty common knowledge, and it was pretty common knowledge that that there was quite a sort of drug culture there. But I think and this is the interesting thing about coke, and the interesting thing I think for me about this interview. There is very few things get my goat more than upper middle class people snorting a line of coke at a party or in the pub or whatever, who then go home and, have their fair trade cups of tea and their organic bananas and eat their quinoa and worry about the world and see no link between the line of coke they've just snorted and the kids bleeding out on the streets of London and Liverpool and Manchester and the county lines and the human misery that causes. Now, I don't know if you can legislate against middle-class people's inability to see, how with one hand they think that they're saving the world and on the other they don't care about kids dying on their own streets. But what I would like to see is influencers in Westminster, in the music industry, in entertainment industry where cocaine is rife, taking a stand against this and beginning to shame people to stop using, because it is utterly destroying some of our estates, some of the families, and half of the drug problems in our country are caused by, upper middle class people who think that they are, worthier than thou and holier than thou and care about fair trade and free range eggs, but don't care about kids bleeding out on our streets. And it absolutely gets my goat.
Okay. But do you think that a war on drugs, as described in the Prime Minister's interview in The Sun on Sunday, is going to be the solution on this? I mean, I've lost count of how many wars on drugs we've had and how much legislation has been passed to crack down hard, to stop county lines, to put those responsible for pushing drugs to kids behind bars. None of it has worked. Where we have seen reduction in drug abuse is in places like Portugal, where decriminalisation of drugs has been very successful. We've seen large parts of America decriminalise cannabis. We've seen, the Netherlands have a culture on drugs that's very different. Where we've seen drug use go down is when people have stopped talking about a war on drugs and have actually been realistic of what drugs people are going to use and how they can help people that get into trouble when using drugs.
Well, look, I mean, I'm not entirely sure that the evidence of decriminalisation is all that black and white.
Well, you look at Portugal, and it's very hard to argue with their drug use because it's significantly reduced when they started taking a different approach to having a simple war on drugs.
Well, okay. I remain unconvinced that decriminalisation is necessarily the answer. I certainly don't think that decriminalisation of all drugs is the answer. I think resources is some of the issue. But I think a lot of this has to be a whole society problem. This isn't just for governments to solve or for the police to solve or a matter of resources. is for people to own up and take responsibility for what they're doing and understand the impact, and if not be shamed into understanding the impact of what they're doing and the consequences on communities, poor communities in their own country, and the misery that they are causing because they want to snort a line on a Saturday night so they can party for another half an hour. That's where I think some real impact could be made if people within industries where drug taking is rife start to take a stand.
Now, the lead story of The Independent Online is about a group of senior Conservatives demanding a radical overhaul of the asylum system to allow migrants to claim refuge at UK embassies anywhere in the world rather than having to travel to Britain first. It reports that former Cabinet Ministers David Davis and Andrew Mitchell are amongst those backing the initiative to reduce the number of migrants attempting the dangerous Channel crossings. The Independent describes this as a stark challenge to what it calls the punitive approach taken by Boris Johnson and the Home Secretary Priti Patel, who have demanded tighter controls on French beaches and threatened to push back small boats at sea. Gary, what do you make of this? Do you think it'll make a difference? Do you think it'll stop people, desperate people, making that completely crazy journey, not just over the Channel, but even the land journey is a very, very dangerous journey at that?
Well, you need to speak to an expert on asylum seekers to get an answer, but it looks in theory to me like it prevents Channel crossings. You know, if people are able to make the application without crossing the Channel, why on earth would you cross the Channel? But I just wanted to speak a little bit. I've been asked to speak a few times recently about the migrant crisis, and there's a real dangerous confusion the way we speak about it between immigration in general and asylum seekers. Mm-hmm. Asylum seekers are tiny overall population. So we don't need to treat asylum seekers terribly in order to keep migration down. It's because they're a tiny fraction. So for me, you know, we should be a humane country and treat asylum seekers well, and also separately decide the level of migration that we want. And I think these issues are conflated like a ridiculous amount. We can treat asylum seekers well, and it will not affect overall migration because asylum seekers are a tiny percentage of overall migration in this country. They're separate issues.
Kirsty, what's your take on this, briefly?
Yeah, I agree with Gary up to a point. I think there is a lot of conflation between migration and asylum. I think this is an attempt, obviously, to try and ease the pressure between France and Britain and people turning up in Calais and trying to make those terrible crossings. Look, I don't whether it would prevent people turning up and taking their chances, and the horrendous human trafficking that has grown up around this. I don't know. I doubt it. I suspect.
I don't think
because if you are a legitimate asylum seeker, you would be able to turn up at an embassy, and if you are not, you will still try and make the crossing.
I think you may be right. I don't think there is a silver bullet. I don't think we're going to end crossings once and for all with one foul swoop. But it sounds like a sensible thing to do to perhaps give people more opportunities to apply for asylum, to apply to come to the UK, because recently, of course, all those avenues have been reduced over the years. So people are forced to make that journey over the water. Now, look, well, one last story. Here's a question for you. How does Prince William get himself going on a Monday morning? Well, apparently, he listens to this. That's Thunderstruck by AC/DC. Didn't even play the best bits. And that's the one thing we learned from the Duke of Cambridge's appearance on Apple's Time to Walk podcast, which encourages people to take a stroll to boost their well-being. Many of the papers pick up some of his other comments in the main story. It leads both on the Mail on Sunday and the Sunday Express under the headline, William's mental health crisis. The Mail speaks of the Prince being engulfed by a dark cloud of anguish and depression when as a helicopter ambulance pilot, he helped to save a badly injured young boy of similar age to his son, George. Gary, we've definitely entered a new era of how we talk about the royals and how we see the royals. A lot of them sharing personal stories like mental health.
Yeah, and we've definitely also entered the new era in the way we talk about mental health, which I think is fantastic and super important because, I'm not too old myself, and what I see often around me is so many young people struggling with mental health problems. And, Prince William has gone on this podcast, which encourages people to take a walk, and I think that's a great idea. If you're struggling with mental health, go take a walk. it can help, but I think it runs the risk of perhaps trivialising what is happening from the economic perspective. Because look at what is happening, right? Ordinary people's wages are not keeping up with cost of living. House prices are doubling, food prices going up, bills are going up. Ordinary people are being continually squeezed economically, while the super rich are making an enormous amount of money. And yet we're turning around and said, well, have you thought about going taking a walk? You know, ordinary young people in this country can't afford housing, secure housing to raise their kids in. If you don't provide that, you will have a mental health crisis. So, listen, if Prince William is listening to aggressive music and that's helping him feel better, good for Prince William and good for his family. You know what I mean? But at the same time, let's address the real problems and not trivialise the serious mental health crisis that is happening because of economic reasons. OK, some good points there. Kirsty, very, very briefly, what are your thoughts?
Look, 1 in 4 of us suffer from mental health problems at some point in our life. I think the Duke of Cambridge wants to talk openly and emotively and very honestly about his mental health problems, so that can only be for the benefit to encourage others to do the same.
Look, thank you both. Sorry to rush you. We're running all the way out of time. Too many stories to talk about today. Thank you, Kirsty Buchanan, former political editor at the Sunday Express and special advisor at 10 Downing Street, and also economist and former city trader Gary Stevenson. Plenty to come after the news. Stick around. It's the Sweet Bobby podcast.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Housing could be so much more affordable, wages could be so much higher, and we could have so many more options in how we live our lives. Some of them put a lot of money into paying economists and think tanks to tell you that inequality is important for the economy. That is not true.